Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, so we are happy to have Andy Skipacz from Stanford GSB. You see, how do you like that? Is that not to get a native speaker to pronounce your name?
Thank you very much.
So does that make you feel welcome?
Very much.
Good. Okay, so we're happy to have Andy S. here from Stanford. And he's here for the whole week, I believe. So if people want to talk to him, you can still get on his calendar. He's going to talk about optimal dynamic auctions for durable goods, posted prices, and fire sales.
Thank you very much. So this is a joint work with Simon Board, who is at UCLA. And as I said, my name is Andy. Please stop me during the talk anytime you have a question, and we'll talk about. So this paper, I'll tell you more what it is about, but one kind of tangent story behind it is when I came to Stanford and I was doing auctions, one of the faculty at Stanford said, well, yeah, you guys do auctions, but auctions are kind of second order in the real economy because most of the things we sell around the world is through posted prices. So not that it was planned, but I think to some extent this paper will be a way of getting back at that comment, because what I'll try to show is that there is a way of thinking about the pricing problem, to think through it about as an auction. It will make it easier to solve it, and then in the end, this is where the second subtitle comes. Once I figure out what the optimal auction is, I'll be able to link it back to prices. And in fact, it's very much in the Stanford tradition. If you ever read Paul Klemper or Buehler-Roberts, The Simple Economics of Optimal Auctions, there's this beautiful connections between pricing and auctions. And I hope this paper will have some, I don't know if that beautiful, but some connections too. So that would be the idea. And the basic problem we are working on is the following. There's a seller who has K units for sale, and he has to sell those units by T. So I'll write it down so we remember. There will be K units and sell by T. Now, why does he have to sell them by T? There will be two possible interpretations. One will be that those objects physically expire. There will be one case, and there will be another case in which at T, any potential buyers that could have entered by now have entered, and then it will turn out that the optimal auction will be such that you just run the last auction, you don't use time, even though people will be staying on the market, you will not be using time to allocate the good if there's no more people arriving anymore. And as I said, this will be a dynamic problem, so the buyers will be arriving over time. This will be a private values environment, so buyers arriving, when they arrive at the market, they will draw values from some distributions. They will know privately what the values are, and possibly they will also know privately when they arrived. Throughout most of the paper, I'll be making an assumption that actually the seller observes when they arrive, because that makes the notation a bit easier. But then magically, once I all have the implementation of the optimal mechanism, it will turn out it doesn't matter at all. And hence, it will be also a solution to the problem where the seller doesn't observe when people arrive. So it will be a full online world. There's one case which the paper will not cover, is a case in which buyers see each other arriving, but the seller doesn't observe them arriving. That turns out that's the one case which we don't know how to solve. But the cases where the seller and the buyers observe everybody arriving, we cover, and also the case where the buyers don't observe anything and the seller could observe or not observe when the other buyers are arriving. Now, a key assumption in this paper will be that buyers will be forward-looking, which means they will arrive to the market and they will be deciding whether to buy now or to wait for the price to go down and buy later. And a key assumption that makes this problem non-trivial is that buyers will prefer to buy earlier rather than later. How much they prefer earlier? Yes. So the way I'll be modeling is will be via discounting costs. Okay, and then I'll have all the buyers having the same discount rate. Now, on the there's an alternative way of explaining why trading earlier may be better than trading later, would be not to have any discounting on the buyer side, but rather than that, have the inventory costs on the seller side. So this would be an example of physical goods, and if the seller has to keep the inventory, he has to pay per unit of time and per unit of goods some flow cost of carrying the inventory, and that would be another reason why the seller, everything else equal, may prefer to sell things earlier to avoid inventory costs. And the two questions that shape the paper are the following: is first, in terms of mechanism design, what's the optimal dynamic mechanism? And then there's a second question. Once I tell you what the optimal mechanism is, which will be described by allocation rules, there will be a question, well, you typically give me a mechanism, there's lots of ways of implementing it that all lead to the same expected revenue by the revenue equivalence theorem. So here will be the question, can we find kind of a simple and natural way of implementing this optimal mechanism, and not to keep the attention and suspense in the room? We'll be trying to go towards posted prices. Can we figure out the way that once I figure out all the optimal mechanisms, that in the end of the day, I can simply use posted prices that have to be specifically computed, but maybe it could work through posted prices. Good. So this whole model is in fact very operation research-like. In fact, there has been recently interest in very similar models, but historically there's been a lot of research on something called the yield management problem. And the big difference between the old papers on yield management problem and what we are doing is this assumption that consumers are forward-looking in our case. So that old yield management papers will have people arrive at the market that look at the price is less than their value, they buy. If it's more than their value, they disappear. Okay? And these models have been very widely applied. They've been applied by airlines, by car rentals company, by hotels, and I've read also that even clothing retailers started using them to manage inventory. Okay? And so the first question is, this is the main difference between the models. You know, that we assume people are forward-looking and those models don't. And the question is, do we have any evidence? And I hope you will like the next slide. So there's evidence that, you know, there are these, so I hope some of you have used Bing before. So if you look for a flight on Bing, there is the forecast thing. I don't think it's written anymore, that's forecast. It used to be a separate company bought by Microsoft, incorporated into Bing. When you look for a flight, you get a tip saying whether the prices are likely to drop or go up or stay constant. And in this case, it's a tip to wait because it's likely the prices would go down. There's some confidence interval. Turns out this is the fare history. You can click on somewhere here on the tip. You'll get more information. You can get that the lowest fares will stay within $15 with 60% confidence. Lowest fares will drop in this range with that confidence. So you get, you know, a little bit more information. And I'm presuming people are actually using this because otherwise Microsoft wouldn't buy it. And so that's a good example that people care about it. We have the technology. Oh, come on, I'm trying to be nice.
Are using it.
Yeah, people are using it. Good, let's stay there. All right, so the point being that these kinds of tools for predictions have become, you know, given that because technology costs went down and we have internet right now, we can have those tools available widely to people. You know, I'm sure some of you have run some regressions in your life before. I remember, you know, when I was buying a house, my empirical friends told me, well, you should run a regression on past sales to figure out whether this house is overpriced or not. You should not listen to your real estate agent. So, but, you know, not everybody on the street is going to do this. Instead, we can have those tools to help us doing those predictions. And of course, also there's this big, you know, not everybody has data on past prices of airline tickets, so it makes sense that somebody economizes on those transaction costs. So that's one example that it looks like people care, and in fact, my prediction is, if anything, we'll see more and more of this, people trying to time those decisions. And the applications I have in mind are the following. One is selling advertising slots for display advertising. The deadline, the capital K is the amount of inventory that New York Times has on September 1st, and capital T is September 1st. Okay. Another example would be seasonal clothing. You have a given inventory that you already produced, and the cost is, the longer you wait, the fewer days you have in the summer to wear this clothing, so the values are dropping kind of proportionally to the time. It's not true that capital T means the value totally expires, but you can think if you are, say, diesel company and you don't sell, then you have to put it, go start selling it through other channels at discounted prices. So there's some date, which may be a little bit fuzzy, around where the season ends, where the price kind of drops discontinuously. You can think similarly, selling cars, when the new model comes in, the price of the old model, the value of the old model to customers changes almost discontinuously, or at least there's a round of time close to the release of the new model where the values are dropping faster. And then with concentric, it's clear what I mean. With housing, there would be an example in which maybe there is no capital T, but what happens is when you put a house on the market, originally there is a stock of buyers that are looking right now on the market. So originally the flow of people looking at your house will be high, and they will not all come immediately the first day you put the house on the market, but there will be, say, a couple of weeks when you'll have a big flow of new people, and over time you'll move to just seeing the new flow of new potential buyers coming to the market actually. So there will be this feature in this model. We haven't actually solved that exactly without this capital T, but you can imagine that if the flow at some point completely dries out, then there would be our model. Okay, good. In most, what I will show you will be a modeling with constant flows, but we have a section in the paper dealing with decreasing flows as well. What else do we have? What's the evidence about people forward looking? There's some empirical research showing that if you estimate the elasticity of demand using temporary sales versus permanent sales, you're going to get different numbers. If you're going different numbers, that suggests that people are doing some kind of intertemporal price comparison. And there's other things. So the timing of sales of cars, of consumer electronics. And one example, people talk about the cash for clunkers program. To a large extent, the increasing demand was attributed to just time shifting. That people say, well, if I was going to buy 6 months from now, but then the cash for clunkers program is not going to work anymore, to be in working anymore, I'll just speed up my purchase. Apparently in England, there is a time in the year where the tax treatment of a car purchase changes discretely, and you see a pattern in sales that people time to be exactly at the right amount. Okay, and then we have now these price prediction websites. I don't know if there's more than other websites which are popular other than FERC or other than Bing, but I expect that over time we'll see more of them. Okay, good. So the model I'll try to write, rather than writing a model that fits any of those applications very, very clearly, I'll try to write this relatively stylized model. We'll try to capture these particular ideas, and if you would like to work on optimal pricing in any one of those particular industries, you may want to start putting additional layers. So here's the model. There will be k identical goods. Time will be discrete and finite. And entry of potential buyers will be happening the following way. At the start of period t, there will be NT buyers arriving, where NT may be a random variable. Okay? And for what I show you mostly, NT in fact will be a random variable which will have constant distribution over time, but in the paper, as I said, we have extensions to allowing the distribution of NT to either be increasing in stochastic dominant sense or decreasing in stochastic dominant sense. And as I said, for now I'll assume that the arrivals are observed by the seller but not the bidders. Later I'll show you the magic that makes it doesn't matter. And also I'll assume for now that the buyers that arrive on the market do not see how many units are still remaining, how big is the inventory. Again, it will not turn out not to matter that in the optimal mechanism the seller would not want to cheat about that. And the important feature of the model, and I'll come back to this at the end if we have time, is that there's no exits. When people arrive at the market, they stay. And it turns out that a model in which when people arrive randomly and then exit randomly, even if it's exogenous exits, turns out to be much, much more complicated. And I'll show you an example at the end, that these nice features, that the optimal mechanism is nice and simple, will completely fall apart if people can exit randomly. Good. The preferences, as I said, entrants have potential values V, which are drawn IAD from some distribution over a compact interval. Most of the discussion will show, I'll use the following preferences. You buy it at time t and you pay price p, your payoff is this one. But of course, you can also imagine a setup in which your value is discounted, but the price is not. So with hotels, it doesn't matter when you contract it, you always pay at the checkout. So price is not discounted. That turns out to be completely inconsequential because you just take all the money, it's just the accounting issue. Do you write money in times 0 net present value, or you write money at the cap t net present value? Everything else stays exactly the same. And then there's another model which turns out to look very similar. If we have time, I can show you that the value to the buyers is independent of time, is V minus P, but there's inventory cost on the side of the seller. You may say, I would also like to have a model in which there is a waiting cost for the buyers that they have to be sitting and watching the website. That kind of a model is a little bit tricky to solve actually, because there's this issue whether I should be keeping people, or can I force people to be sitting and waiting, or can they exit on their own? And should I tell them to exit because I don't want them to be sitting? So that's the case we haven't solved. There's a common discount rate for all the buyers. And in the extremes, when discount factor is 0, well, then this is a trivial problem. It's just a sequence of myopic problems. When discount factor is 1, again, it's a trivial problem. You just wait till the end and run one big auction with everybody who arrived by then. So again, it turns into a static problem. And what the seller cares about, he cares about the net present value of revenue that he receives from people. Now, what is a mechanism? The mechanism is the following. We'll work with direct revelation mechanisms. Agents will be reporting their value upon entry, and the mechanism maps the vectors of reports to the probability that bidder I gets the good at time t, given the reports of everybody, and transfer using time 0 money, which depends on all the reports. And there are constraints, feasibility constraints on these things, that you cannot give more goods than you have, and so on. And also the information constraints. The way I wrote it is that this probability function depends on the reports of everybody. The way I'm thinking about it, everybody that is going to enter is going to report at time 0, but I'm going to have these information constraints that this function has to be measurable with respect to the information the bidder has at time t. So even though there are values here in this function of people who arrive at period 5, at period 3, this function can depend only on the reports reported by time 3. Okay? Sir. So this is how much money if you report this type and everybody reported those types, you as a buyer, you have to pay me this much money in time 0 money.
Right. Why is it independent of which time slot I'm selling it?
So the mechanism is these two functions. So once I know all these reports, I know immediately both of these things. Now, if this is a random mechanism, in my model all the buyers are risk neutral, I just compute the average, and turns out that it's the same mechanism. Good.
So I don't quite understand your discount factor, because it's sort of, let's say, in the airline situation.
Good.
I don't have it as a buyer. I sort of, what kind of discount factor do I have?
Yeah.
It's sort of actually a negative one, right? If I pay earlier, I can't make interest on my money.
So the way I think about airlines,
You say I only pay on the day I fly, in which case I wouldn't really care which day I fly.
So the way I think about airlines, about the preference to buy earlier, is I would not really model it really as discounting necessarily, but the preferences for buying it earlier come from the fact that you want to coordinate your other activities. And the more time you have, so when you know where you're going and everybody pays for your expenses, then you actually don't care. But if you're going on your holiday, then you say, well, I want to know on which day I'll be flying, because then I want to find the hotel, that I want to find somebody to take care of my plants at home that I leave that need to be watered and so on. And the more time you have to plan, the cheaper it is for you to buy these complementary activities.
May also be the other way around, but I'm really busy and I only know 2 days before my vacation.
It could be. So no, but then this is fine. This is in fact fine. Then that means that you're a person who's not going to arrive to this auction at time 0. You're really busy. You cannot be bothered with buying it early. You're only going to show up at this auction at two days before the flight. Okay, so no, but I think it's very important. So this is how I think about it. Why isn't it so that everybody is on the market at the same time? Why don't we? Somebody asked me, why hasn't websites like Priceline.com become the most prevalent way of selling airline tickets, hotels, car rentals? Why with the internet? Why don't we sell all these things through auctions? And I think my best answer right now is auctions. Kind of typical auctions that we run, it require that people are at the same time in the auction. But there are people like you that say, I cannot be bothered to show up in this auction a particular day, so that the auctioneer can aggregate the demand and supply and clear the market. So this is why I think this model says, well, in a sense I can still think about it as being an auction, but it's kind of a dynamic auction in which I take as an exogenous constraint that people will be arriving at different times and cannot be bothered to come earlier. With advertising, the story I have is that if you are Gillette and you have a new razor, you want to know in advance when your ads will be shown, because you want to coordinate that the same week your ads are being shown, your goods are being delivered to the stores. And the less time you have to coordinate it, the more costly the transportation will be. So that's how I think the preference is for time. Discounting just happens to be the functional form that makes the math a little bit easier. Good. Now, what do the agents do? Just like in the regular valuation mechanism, always they pick reports to make given their true type to maximize the value they get times the probability they get at given time times discount factor minus the expected transfer. And what would we do? Well, I can take the envelope condition of this, that if I differentiate with respect to the true type, evaluate it with a report equal to true type, I'll get the derivative of the equilibrium utility function given the value, and then I integrate it out, and that tells me that in equilibrium, if it's going to be incentive compatible, the value of each type, if he reports truthfully, has to be given by this integral formula. It's true that compared to the typical single period optimal auctions, I have this extra complication here, but it doesn't really matter. The true type shows up only here. So after you take the envelope condition, you get everything that multiplies the true type is going to show up in this integral. Okay? And then turns out that, like always in mechanism design, there's going to be another constraint that has to be satisfied for the mechanism to be incentive compatible, is that the allocation has to be monotone. So typically we say the higher types have to have higher probability of getting the good, and here higher types have to get the higher discounted probability of getting the good. Okay? So it turns out if your mechanism satisfies these two constraints, it's incentive compatible. And what I've hidden here is I have assumed that the lowest type gets 0 surplus. So because I took the integral, so I don't have the constant, I'm setting the constant to 0, which means the IR constraint will be satisfied. Yes? Oh, because the transfer function does not depend on your true type. It only depends on your reported type. So this is the beauty of pure private values. Okay, good. Now, yeah, I love the envelope theorem. So we can, if you would like to talk, what are the cases of auctions in which it doesn't drop out? It's one of my favorite topics. Good. So what is the seller going to do? The seller is going to maximize the expected total surplus. But just like always in optimal auctions, what do? We say, what is total surplus? Total surplus, the seller maximizes his total revenue. But what is total revenue? Total revenue is equal to total surplus minus the surplus of the buyers. So what do? Well, as always we do in optimal auctions, we say, well, that's the surplus of the buyers given their type. We integrated over all types. That's their average surplus. We added up all buyers, subtracted from the total surplus, which also the nice thing is here, even though the surplus of each buyer depends both on the allocation function, the transfer function, once you do this envelope theorem trick, it depends on the allocation rule. Now total surplus, because these transfers are just transfers, total surplus depends on the allocation rule. So after you do this accounting trick, you can write down that the profits of the seller actually depend only on those allocation rules. They do not on the transfers, which you should know as the revenue equivalence theorem. That in private value auctions, the revenue depends on the allocation rule and not actually on the payment rule. Good. And what is this m function? Turns out, to get actually this formula, you have to do a little bit of integration by parts. And what is this m? Well, at Stanford, we call it the marginal revenue of a buyer. And if you're used to more language from Meyerson, that would be called the virtual valuation. Okay? And why is, another one of my favorite topics, why do we call it marginal revenue? That it turns out it's the same thing as you would do as a monopolist. You would compute marginal revenue curve. It will turn out to look the same way. Good. So now what I'll assume that this marginal revenue function is monotone. And that's what's going to buy me is when I'll be solving for the optimal auctions, completely disregarding this monotonicity condition that the allocations are increasing types. It will give me that after I finish everything, the constraint will be satisfied. Okay, so first the single unit problem. Turns out to be the simplest. So we're trying to maximize the expected discounted marginal revenue of the people we give the good to. Okay, and we'll write it down as dynamic programming problem. The profits we get at time t, if we solve it, depend on the profits we get from the allocation today, and there are some continuation profits. Now, these are not really continuation profits, because if you change the mechanism at period t plus 1, it's going to change your revenues that you get at earlier periods. Because, for example, if you reduce the price in period t plus 1, then people will be reluctant to buy earlier. So these functions take this into account. These pi functions are the contribution to the total profit from all the periods of changes to the mechanism at period t plus 1 forward. Okay? And at capital T, it's very easy. At capital T, it's a static problem. What are I going to do? Well, maximizing the marginal revenue of the person we give it to, given that I assume that these functions are monotone, it's optimal to give it to the person with the highest value, subject to the marginal revenue being non-negative. Okay? Good. So at capital T, in other words, we run a simple static optimal auction. Now, let's go one period back. Okay, before I go one period back, let me introduce the state variable. So state variable is what's the value of the highest guy that arrived so far. If I have only one unit, that's the only thing I care about. I don't care about the second highest unit. Sorry, the second highest guy. Now you say, well, wait a minute. If you run in capital T a second price auction, actually you care about the second highest guy because he sets the price. That's true, but on average not. Just like the average revenue from the second price auction will be equal to the average revenue from the first price auction. In the first price auction, your revenue is equal to the highest guy. So we're totally fine. Okay? So what's the expected revenue in the last period if you enter it with the highest guy that arrived so far having value V? It will be the expectation over the marginal value either of that type or the first order statistic of the guys that arrive at capital T, or 0 if all of these are negative. Okay. Now let me go one period back. What's going to happen? Well, at one period back, what you're maximizing is the following. If you arrive at period T with the highest guy so far being V, you can either give the good to this guy and collect that much revenue. You can give to the highest guy that arrived at period, or you can decide to do neither and go to the next period and have a higher, potentially higher outside option. Good. Now the solution to this problem will turn out to be just the cutoff xt. And the cutoff, let me think, the kind of surprising thing is that this cutoff that solves this maximization problem, for which whether you exercise one of those two options or that, or you continue, this cutoff will be is independent of v. Yes.
Can you allocate more than one unit at each period of time, or?
So now I'm solving a single unit problem, but in general, yes, I can allocate multiple units. Good. So, moreover, what turns out is that this optimal cutoff will satisfy the following equations. Will satisfy that the optimal cutoff at the last period is just the static optimal cutoff, but the optimal cutoff at another time will satisfy the following equation, which is just one period look ahead. There's nothing to, turns out the solution you can find without solving it in dynamic programming. Turns out the solution satisfies the following. You're indifferent between allocating the good today or waiting for one period and for sure allocating the good tomorrow. And what does it mean that for sure allocate the good tomorrow? Well, tomorrow you still have the same guy around, but maybe somebody better will come. Okay? So what it means is that this is time, this is capital T, this is the optimal cutoff. The cutoff will be constant, and then at capital T it drops discontinuously. This is k equal to 1 case. Okay? And it's a little, the fact that the cutoff at capital T minus 1 is higher than the capital T is clear because at period, if you have still time remaining, you have this additional option value from waiting, which you didn't have at capital T. So that makes this right-hand side bigger. So the solution has to be bigger. But kind of surprising, at least when I first saw it, is that other than that, the cutoff stays constant. And the intuition is, well, I have a whole proof written here, so let's figure out how it works. So suppose that starting at period t plus 1 onwards, the cutoff is constant until capital T then drops. And now I come at time t, and suppose I have some value which is less than xt computed according to this formula, which is a constant formula. Then, well, given that v is less than xt, then the marginal revenue at this type is less than the right-hand side of this formula. But this is a lower bound which you can achieve in the equilibrium, in your optimal mechanism, because you can decide to even next period even wait longer, but at least you can commit yourself to be selling tomorrow. But if this thing is bigger than this, then for sure you don't want to sell today. So that's going one way. So that tells you why the cutoff cannot be growing over time and then decrease. But that's not the case really. That is surprising. The thing surprising is why isn't the cutoff kind of continuously going down? So let's see. Suppose I have a type which is more than xt today. Then what's going to happen? Now the proof is by induction. The proof by induction says, well, tomorrow that means I'll have a type which is higher than tomorrow's cutoff, because this guy is already higher than today's cutoff, and according to this formula, and because I'm assuming that by induction hypothesis that this thing holds, xt plus 1 is equal to this, and by induction hypothesis, this will be the optimal thing to do to sell. So actually, if v is more than xt plus 1, tomorrow this is my actual payoff. But this is the right-hand side of this equation I had before. So that tells me that actually I'm strictly better off selling today. Because I know, from knowing what I'm going to follow tomorrow, I know what my continuation payoff is. I'd rather not wait. If you don't trust math, think about it this way. It turns out the key is this one period look ahead policy. One period look ahead policy says that the cutoff you're indifferent between selling today. If you have a guy exactly at the cutoff, you're indifferent between selling to him today and waiting for one period hoping that somebody better will come. Well, if you're only doing one period look ahead policy, whether in period 1 or in period 7, the value of one more person the is exactly the same problem because you're only looking one period ahead, so it doesn't matter how long horizon is remaining. Okay, good. So what are the properties of these cutoffs? I told you there will be this one look period ahead policy. The cutoff is deterministic. It depends on time only, but not on the number of entrants or their values or in which periods they arrived. And then in discrete time, you can implement this auction the following way. You can run a second price auction with reserve prices, which will be actually declining over time. Even though the optimal cutoff is constant, the optimal reserve price will be declining over time. Okay, and I'll explain it in continuous time in a minute. And in fact, the reserve prices will be declining faster than the time preference. Immediately you can see that if you want to keep the constant cutoff guide to be indifferent between buying now and delaying, if the price is not dropping at least at the rate of interest, then they will immediately buy. But it turns out we'll have to be dropping even faster. So let me tell you why. So in continuous time limit, what do I have? I'm assuming now in continuous time, agents arrive via constant Poisson rate lambda. So what is the optimality condition now is by not selling to the cutoff guy today, you lose interest per unit of time of the margin revenue. What's the gain? With arrival rate lambda, instead of selling him, you'll sell to somebody better. Okay? And that again is a constant. And what will be the prices? There will be a differential equation for prices. So what's going to be the differential equation for prices? So what's the cost of delaying a purchase for the cutoff guy? Well, there are two costs. So if he buys today, he gets this much profit, x minus the posted price. And if he delays, he loses this interest. But also he runs the risk that somebody new will arrive and will have a higher value than him, and there will be a stock out. And this is a second reason why people will want to speed up purchases, because they're afraid, given that there's a finite inventory, that somebody will come and the good will be stocked out. So for that reason, prices have to be dropping faster than just by the interest rate. They have to be dropping to accommodate the stock out risk. And then this is just differential equation. There's going to be also a boundary condition. Where does the boundary condition come from? Right before the end of the game, the cutoff guy has to be indifferent between buying at the last buy it now price or entering this auction. And what will be his revenue in the auction? Well, he says, I know that between time 0 and capital T, nobody has arrived better than me, because then they would have bought by now. But there's maybe somebody right here, somebody right here, somebody right here. So there's some probability distribution he has in his belief over how many people arrived and what's the distribution of values in this range. And then he says, well, the expected payment I'll have to make in the auction is the expected first-order statistic of my competition. And he, at capital T, has to be just indifferent between this buy it now price and that the revenue from the auction, and that anchors that differential equation. And that gives you the full implementation. That in continuous time, you can implement the optimal auction by having posted prices that follow this differential equation, and then at capital T, you run an auction. And it's important to run the auction because these cutoffs are discontinuous. Okay, good. So that's how it looks. I compute an example with values being distributed uniformly between 0 and 1. Total amount of time was 1, interest rate being 1 over 16, and you see the prices are slowly going down, and then there's big auction at the end. So now the multi-unit problem. So the multi-unit problem, it turns out that again the solution is characterized by cutoffs. The optimal mechanism is characterized by cutoffs. And these cutoffs are deterministic and depend only on how much time is remaining and how much inventory is remaining. They do not depend on when agents entered, what are the valuations, or when previous units were sold. Okay? Those cutoffs turn out to be decreasing over time. So if you have only 1 unit remaining, the cutoff is constant. But if you have 2 units remaining, the cutoff actually is decreasing, and it continuously converges to the static cutoff. Okay, and I'll explain to you in a second why this is a little bit different when you have 2 units versus 1. and they converge continuously. So you actually, the auction matters only if you arrive to the last period with exactly 1 unit remaining. Okay, good. And the cutoffs jump up as you start selling inventory. And then within periods, this is what Bunyo was asking, can I sell multiple units in one period? Yes. So what happens if I have, suppose this is my cutoff, if I have 1 unit remaining, and that's my cutoff when I have 2 units remaining. This is T2. This is if I have 3 units remaining. And suppose what I get is I get bidders with values here, here, and here, and here. So suppose that period 4 people arrived. I didn't have anybody before, and now I have these values. So what's going to happen? Well, this guy has the highest value. I'll allocate to him the first unit. Now this guy has the second highest value, and he is still, so this thing is out. Now he has value higher still than the cutoff of 2, so he will get this good, but that will be it. I will not sell 3 units. Even though it looks like I have 3 people over the cutoffs, I will not allocate the 3rd unit because I allocate the goods in the order of values. Good. Okay, and let me show you how to compute these cutoffs in continuous time. So it turns out the following equation holds in continuous time. If you have somebody equal to the current cutoff, yes?
I'm confused by that. So you only have multiple users at the same time in the case where you end up at the very end, right? And you're running down.
So in discrete time, you can have multiple users. So in discrete time, in fact, implementing this optimal thing, it's a little bit tricky. I think you have to stop time and run a sequence of auctions. And you had Maher here recently, right? So Maher talked about there's this issue, there may be information leakage between auctions. So actually, I think he would be the expert of figuring out the implementation discrete time, how to run it. I think it can be done by running these second price auctions in which you don't reveal what people were bidding. You just reveal, okay, this guy won, and he's out of the market. But not you don't want to reveal the second highest bid, because then there will be information leakage, which will lead to a problem that people who are old bidders from previous periods and new people arriving will have asymmetric distributions. The asymmetric distributions, even if you run a second price auction, the valuations are how people would bid are affected by expected continuation payoffs, and those may be different for different people. So for that reason, the way I would implement it would be the second price auctions in which you don't reveal prices. But I have the implementation continuous time in which I don't have to worry about it. Good. Now, so what's the condition? So we said this before. You know, if you delay, you lose interest on the marginal revenue of the current cutoff guy, and you gain that somebody with arrival rate lambda, somebody new may arrive and you'll make more. But when you have multiple units, there's another term. Before, if you sell to the guy today, and somebody better arrives tomorrow, you're screwed because you already sold all your units. But now, if you started with 2 units, you still have a second unit to sell, which means you don't lose as much. By going early, you don't lose as much because if somebody really good arrives, you still have the good. So you get this thing that by waiting, you also affect the continuation payoffs. And that difference actually changes over time. Because if you have a lot of time remaining, then your continuation payoff doesn't depend much on the current state because, well, whatever, I still have a lot of people who come. But as it gets close to the end, actually that gets small. So the difference gets big. It matters a lot who you have. And for that reason, if you have multiple items, because the continuation payoff term changes over time, these cutoffs are decreasing. Good. And also what's important is now when it comes to implementing and via prices, it turns out that the prices that implement these cutoffs are much more complicated. So let me show you it via graph. So I computed first the cutoffs. Again, this is example, uniform distribution of values. Arrival rate is lambda per unit of time. Total time is 1. And interest rate is 1/16. And I computed what are the cutoffs when I have still 2 units remaining. Nobody bought. So the optimal cutoff starts pretty high, at about 8.85, and over time it converges continuously to this optimal static cutoff of a half in uniform distribution. And these are the prices. They also continuously converge to a half. Now, suppose you started with 2 units and you sold 1 unit, and now you have only 1 unit remaining. Now, in terms of the cutoffs, we are back in the problem of 1 unit case, but in terms of prices, not. So in fact, I draw 3 price curves here. This is the red price curve corresponds to a situation that you sold the first of the 2 units at time 0. This blue curve corresponds to selling at 0.3, and the pink curve to selling at 0.6. Now, the differential equation that describes them is still exactly the same, but it's different boundary condition. Why is the different boundary condition? Let's recall what was the boundary condition. The guy at capital T, the last posted price, has to be indifferent between taking it and waiting for this auction. How much profit he expects to get from the auctions? Well, it depends on how many people he thinks he's facing sitting here between 0.5 and 0.9. But that depends on when this transaction happened. If it happened very early, there was a lot of time for these guys to arrive. If it happened at 0.6, you see this cutoff is higher than that cutoff. So if it happened at 0.6, he knows that by 0.6 there was nobody in this range. So he's facing weaker competition. And as a result, even though the cutoffs are independent of the history, the prices that implement them have to depend on the history. Okay, good. Now, it will be interesting to ask a question in an applied situation. Does it really matter? Is it quantitatively relevant? But theoretically, that's what happens. Okay. So I told you this is how the implementation would work in continuous time. The nice thing in continuous time is that because these cutoffs are continuous, the probability that in DT I'll either hit one of the existing guys and at the same time somebody will arrive is on the order of DT squared, so I don't have to worry about it. So I don't have to run an auction other than this case when I hit here and the cutoff decreases discontinuously, and then I have probability mass of there is a strictly positive probability there will be multiple people in this range. Okay, so I explained that. Yeah, there's another interesting thing that these cutoffs, you can compute. What you should have noticed is that I have a k-unit problem, and when I'm writing down this equation for the optimal cutoff when I have k units, I'm writing down continuation profits as a function of only one state variable, where I actually should have k state variables, or k minus 1 state variables in the continuation game. But it turns out that the optimal, even though your profits depend, what's the second highest value of the guy you have currently, and you have 10 units, the optimal cutoffs don't. Because if somebody better arrives tomorrow, it doesn't matter. The second highest guy today gets pushed down to position 3 anyway, whether you sold the first unit early or you sold you waited with the unit till the next period. So for that reason, that ranking doesn't change, so the cutoffs can be computed easily. Now another thing that happens is, in the subtitle I also had something about fire sales. So I described to you posted prices, and I want to talk about fire sales. So one story was, when I had 1 unit, we were having posted price, and then at capital T I ran an auction, which I'll call, you can run this as a Dutch auction, which looks like a fire sale. Now when I have 2 units remaining, then actually I'm not running an auction, but what I computed in this example is a hazard rate of a trade. And it turns out that this hazard rate is growing. Okay, it doesn't go to infinity. I know it may look like I cheat, I wish I could draw it that it's infinity, but it's not. This is a finite amount, but it goes up. And the reason it goes up is that where does the hazard rate come from of sales? Well, either somebody new arrives who is above the cutoff, and because the cutoff goes down, that hazard rate goes up. But also, as the cutoff goes down, there are people sitting there and waiting, and you may hit them. And it turns out that in this example, because this thing is concave, the hazard rate goes up additionally for that reason. Good, and I have uniform distribution, and the thing is concave, so that speeds up additionally the rate of sales. Okay, so plenty of time. You're not stopping me as much as I hope. Good. So inventory costs. So where are the inventory costs? As I told you, the way to think about it, there is a cost per unit of time. If you hold the good and an item until capital T, the total inventory cost is C of T. It doesn't have to be even linear. I'm assuming it's differentiable with continuous first derivative. And then before we had an equation that was saying the value from waiting, which is this, had to be equal to the cost of waiting, which was the interest times the marginal revenue. Now there is no interest rate, so this thing went out. But instead, what is the cost? Well, I have to incur incremental inventory costs. So that becomes the equation for the one good problem. It's the same, yes. Sorry? Sure. Oh.
That's Adam. Don't take him seriously.
Good.
Please, I'm sorry.
I can have a drink. Good. So I'm very happy that works, because there's a lot of applications in which you say, well, I don't really buy discounting. I think discounting is second order. When people are looking to buy a house, you're looking to buy a house, whether you buy it this week or next week, it's really second order, because you're making a big purchase, hopefully for several years. So a day or two of difference, it typically is not a big deal. But I would then think is that it's more of a loss of rental premium for the seller. Now, what are the prices? Well, when there's no inventory costs, so when there's no discounting costs, how much do the prices have to be dropping over time? Well, now there's no interest rate here, but there's going to be two things happening. Now, okay, first of all, now, if this derivative is not constant over time, say as the new model is coming in, the inventory costs, marginal inventory costs get bigger, then this cutoff doesn't have to be constant anymore. Okay, even in the 1 unit case. And then what you're going to get is that this price has to be dropping just to cover the risk of a stock out. And the risk of the stock out comes from the fact that either somebody new arrives and has an even bigger value, or the cutoff goes down and there was somebody sitting, and the probability that somebody sitting around it is lambda times t, and there's a density that they're actually there at equal to you. Okay, and when k is more than 1, there's additional complications of multiple units. That, for example, the buyers say, if I don't buy now, it's not a big deal if somebody arrives. So I haven't shown you the equations for the posted prices. When there's two units, I told you when there's 1 unit, it's the same differential equation. When there's 2 units, the equation has additional feature here that if somebody stocks out, if you have a stock out, you don't get continuation payoff of 0, which is the case when you have k equal to 1, because there's no more goods available. There's this fact that the price will go up because the cutoff goes up, so you end up having lower continuation payoff. Okay, a little bit about other extensions. So one thing is we also solve the problem when the arrival rates change. So in the paper we solve this. We have an example of when the arrival rate is increasing and then drops to 0, and also a case when it's decreasing monotonically. Okay, when it's decreasing, everything is very nice and simple. The optimal cutoff is still 1 period look ahead policy. When it's first increasing until capital T and drops to 0, then actually the optimal cutoffs are first increasing and then decreasing. And to compute them, you have to solve the full dynamic programming problem. It's no longer this 1 period look ahead policy. The new project we're working on right now is thinking about what if these k goods are not identical. Suppose these are Celtics tickets, and I have the higher level and the lower level, and I have to be pricing them. And the question would be, what should be happening with the quality premium or if you think about these being different sizes, you can think about quantity discounts or something like that. How these things should be changing in the optimal pricing as a function of time and inventory. So we hope we'll be able this case to solve. For another application, if you think about airlines, then typically airlines would say, well, f of v is changing. That you get correlation between the distribution of values and when people arrive, the business people buy later than the leisure people, and then I think it's an interesting question to attack this would be first, can I price discriminate between people who arrive earlier or not? And there could be cases in which actually you would want to set a lower price for people who arrive early, and you could imagine trying to put it into the system that if you arrive early, we'll give you a rain check if this thing is stocked out, but then or we'll give you a coupon if you show up. If you show up to the store a week before Christmas, we'll give you a coupon which you can use in January, which sometimes happens. Okay. And then I think it's another interesting thing is to either be learning about the arrival rate or the distribution of values. I think these are interesting things. Good. And then what we did do, we tried to think more about what happens when the values are changing. So one example would be when people arrive, your discounting depends not only what time it is, but also when you arrived. So if you have two people with the same time, but one person arrived earlier, they're kind of more worn down by waiting and looking at the website, so their values drop. So in this case, it turns out the optimal mechanism is still characterized by cutoffs, and the main difference is that at capital T, in the optimal mechanism, if you observe when people arrive, you want to price discriminate based on the arrival. But there's a condition on the distributions that says that actually, under some distributions, you want to treat people who arrived earlier better. It will be an asymmetric auction, and it turns out for some distributions you want to skew things to people who arrive earlier, and maybe you could have then people self-report.
So far, you assume that the arrival times are observed.
Yeah, but
so what happens?
So let me go back to this implementation. So you see, in this implementation, because the optimal mechanism is first, when you still have two units, it's implemented by these prices, which are independent of when people arrive. And hence, I don't need to observe when they arrive. Now, these prices also do not depend on when people arrive. They only depend on the time when you sold. So in this case, you can just be running your website, posting this price. If somebody sells, you even tell people on the website, at that time we sold the first unit, and then you start running this. And you don't need to know when people arrive.
So if I arrive and my value is sort of below the cutoff, I don't report myself.
Exactly. So suppose you arrive, your value is here.
Yeah.
You just sit quietly, you don't say anything, and you just watch the prices dropping, and when this time comes, and the price drops to this level, and there are still two units remaining, then you say, I'll grab it. Okay, so that's kind of this was the beautiful trick that even though I assumed you observe everything, the implementation again in the end does not depend on it. So I solved the other problem as well. Very grim on my face. Good, so why does it happen? Because we are lucky that these cutoffs are independent of the values and the arrival times. Now, the interesting thing is,
Just one step ahead.
yes. So let me now tell you this. So if you take this beta to 0, then we are back in the myopic world. Because that says these people, a period after they arrive, they completely discount their values. Okay? So that allows us to kind of go continuously between one model and the other. But the interesting thing is, if you try to write down a model, so in both models, in the case when people are totally myopic, and the case when people are forward-looking, just like in our model, the optimal mechanism is characterized by these cutoffs, and the cutoffs are only a function of how much time is remaining and what's the inventory remaining. You put a mixture of those two types into the model, this featured falls apart. So no longer it's true that the optimal mechanism has cutoffs which are independent of the types that arrive, and let me explain why. When you have a guy who is myopic, actually the cutoff you would have for his allocation would depend on the best value of the guy who is forward-looking. Because you say, well, if I don't give the good to him, I lose him forever. Well, so I want to compare now the value of giving it to him to my continuation payoff function. But my continuation power function depends on the values of the guys who are going to stay on the market. So that in that world, actually, I would not be able to implement things by these simple posted prices that don't use any feedback. I would need to have people to come to me and say, look, I'm a long-term client. This is the kind of the price I'm interested in. And then you would adjust the myopic guys, you would adjust the price based on that, which would be a much more complicated. Yeah.
There's one other point where I didn't understand why you're not using that information. You've always been using the revenue gain from the arrived extra buyers, the M of V minus the M of whatever.
Mm-hmm. So let's look at this differential equation.
M of V minus M of X.
Yes.
And I would have thought that if XT was, if the high value was greater than M of V but less than XT, then you would be able to extract more revenue when the extra guy came if you knew both values, because then you could, run a second price auction with that guy there for the one remaining item. So, I understand why I can normally just treat it as M of V because it's all.
So remember, this M of V is not this is bad notation. This is not your current highest guy.
That's the arrived.
That's the value of the new guy arriving, and this expectation operator is over that. So what this equation says is saying, well, if I give you a guy who's exactly at the margin of you saying, what's the value of that guy? And it says, well, you're indifferent between giving to the good to him today or incurring the carry costs in this example, and either getting back his value or getting something better. So
so I guess what I don't understand is why something better with M of V rather than something that might be more than M of V if XT is high.
Okay, so I think that just comes from the revenue equivalence theorem. That it's true that you say, well, if it happens to be that, let me think. I think it just comes from the revenue equivalence theorem that if the guy reported you his value for free, truthfully, then yes, you could extract extra surplus, but you still have to give him his information rent in the end of the day. So I think that's why it's happening. I haven't thought about it that way, so I apologize that it's not that clear. But you say, why doesn't my cutoff depend on my current best value? Yeah, it just happens with the revenue equivalence theorem. It's like, why isn't my average revenue depending on the second highest guy? Well, because on average, if I tell you what's the highest guy, on average, it doesn't, because averaging it out, it always averages to the same thing once I give you the highest. So, and here's the last thing I want to show you, the last extension. So here's I told you that there's a big problem when people exit. So let me show you what happens when people exit. So I have the following example. Suppose there's only 2 periods. There will be discrete time. In period 1, I have 2 people. In period 2, there will be 1 more person arriving. There's no discounting, but people disappear from the game with probability 1/9, which is independent across the 2 guys that arrive at period 1. And suppose the values are distributed uniformly between 0 and 1. And then, without loss of generality, assume that the realizations are such that you just label people that V1 is bigger than V2. Then what's going to be the optimal mechanism? Again, it will be a cutoff mechanism, but it will be a very complicated cutoff. So this is the function that says, what's the cutoff that V1 has to be above to give the good in period 1 to get this to player 1 as a function of V2. So this is an example in which the optimal cutoff is not deterministic. It's a function of the second highest value, just like in this counter example that you suggested. And this function, well, it's okay because in some ranges, because here it's constant and here it's constant. But there is a range in which it is strictly increasing. Okay? What's the intuition? Well, if you don't give the good to the guy today, you wait, you run a risk that maybe the best guy will disappear with probability 1/9. And then you will run an auction just between the second highest guy and the new guy. But then the expected revenue from this auction depends on the value of the current second highest guy. So that affects your continuation payoff if you don't allocate the good, and for that reason, the better is the second highest guy, the more reluctant you allocate to the highest guy because you're not worried the highest guy will disappear. Another thing which turns out to be very interesting is that this optimal cutoff in this example is never lower than 0.79, but it still is strictly increasing. Even in V2 is between 0.5 and 0.91. So importantly, it's increasing in V2 even if V2 is less than 0.79, which means the following. I need the buyers to come and report me their values even though they know the probability they will get the good in times 1 is 0. If somebody has value 0.6, they know there's no possibility of report of the other guy that would give them the good today. But I still need them to come, report their type, because that may be important for setting the cutoff for the other guy. And that tells me that this is, in the world where people are disappearing, there is no hope of implementing the optimal mechanism via some simple auctions or some simple posted prices. The optimal mechanism actually is a total mess. Good, conclusions. So first of all, what is different? What did we learn different from the myopic case? So first of all, if you do try to estimate the distribution of values by changing prices, the way you will interpret in those two models how to map the changes in demand to changes in prices would be very different. Because in the myopic case, it's a direct evidence of the elasticity of demand. In our case, it's going to be this whole complicated thing where people have beliefs about what the continuation prices are, what the continuation payoffs are. 2, in our world, the optimal prices are a function of the history, not just of the main inventory and time. While in the myopic world, there's no state variable other than that because everybody that entered until then disappeared, so it doesn't matter. Of course, I should not be pushing that too much because in the myopic world, if you throw learning about the distributions or arrival rates, then again, the optimal prices would start depending on history. But I think it's interesting that in this model, there's another reason you introduce prices. The optimal cutoffs turn out to be easier to compute in our world than in the myopic world. In the myopic world, the optimal cutoffs, you have to actually solve a full dynamic programming problem. And then finally, what I want to stress is that for small k, it's important to run an auction at capital T, even if the arrival is via Poisson process, so people don't come via bunches. So in the myopic case, in discrete time, you would still run auctions, but in continuous time, you would never run an auction. It's never important. Here, it is important to run those auctions. Okay? Now, when is modeling forward-looking buyers important? It will turn out that it's important if the problem is non-stochastic, non-stationary. So if T was infinity, then actually all our cutoffs would be constant, and our prices would be constant. And it doesn't matter whether you model people as myopic or forward-looking. Also, it's important that the markets are thin. If you take both k to infinity and lambda to infinity at the same rate, then in the limit, you converge, there's not going to be an aggregate uncertainty. So you can approximate the first best mechanism by just having deterministic prices again. So it's not going to be a big deal. And let me see. Yeah, and I think that what I want to sell is that in these dynamic markets, when people don't arrive in bunches, but people can arrive at one at a time, the good mechanism will even if you look at the optimal auction mechanism, they will have this form of posted prices plus fire sales. That's what I want you to keep in mind. And he's the guy who wrote a paper about posted prices and fire sales. And that's it. Thank you very much.